Whoa, and you thought you'd eaten a big burger before. That baby's a monster, Mac. I'm telling you, that thing's about as big as he is, and that guy's a big dude. Well, we're going to talk about what would happen possibly if this guy ate too many of those. As we go through the next lessons, we're going to talk tonight and introduce you to some energy health concerns and talk about what might happen on the upper end of this scale that people are eating a little bit too much. So before we do that, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about not telling the truth when you are thinking about skipping out an exam. I want to talk about these four fellows that are, three of them pushing the car, and you can see the one's legs hanging out the door. I want to talk a little bit about what kind of issue they got themselves into. I doubt if they're in the university anymore, but let me tell you their little story, and it might make you think about the excuse that you use next time you don't want to take an exam. So let me just start the story. It's called Testy Testing. One night, Jack Evans, along with his three university friends, went out to drink till late night, as many college students are prone to do, and didn't study for their test, which of course was scheduled for the next day. In the morning, they thought of a plan. They made themselves look as dirty and weird as they could with grease and dirt. They went up to the dean and explained that they had gone out to a wedding last night, and on the return, the tire of their car had burst. They continued to explain how they had pushed the car all the way back and that they were in no condition to appear for the test. The dean, being a compassionate human being, said they could retake the test after 3 days. The students graciously replied that they'd be ready by that time. On the third day, they appeared before the dean. The dean explained that since this was a special test, all four were required to sit in separate rooms for the duration of the exam. They all agreed, as they had prepared well in the last 3 days. The test consisted of 5 questions with a total of 100 points. So when the students got to their rooms, this is what they saw. Mid-semester coursework instructor, all questions are required. Any inconsistencies on any of the questions among the 4 students will result in all the candidates getting a 0 score. Okay? So here are the 5 questions. First one, write down your name, 2 points. Probably thought they had this baby nailed. Write down the name of the bride and groom at the wedding you attended. Might be getting a little nervous at this point. What type of car were you driving? Which tire burst? It's a little more interesting. And who was driving? Not sure unless they really talked about this. I'm sure they didn't expect this kind of an exam. So be careful next time you want to skip an exam and what kind of story you're going to tell. Anyway, I don't know if you'd heard, but in June 18th of 2013, the American Medical Association basically declared obesity as a disease, which, as you can tell, it basically defines millions and millions of American adults and millions of children as having a medical condition that requires treatment, which basically means that insurance companies are now going to have to pay for obesity treatments of any kind. Kind of controversial. I'm not sure whether you agree or disagree with this, but this is where it's at. So what we need to do is talk a little bit about obesity and look at the different kinds of obesity, and then as we go on, we'll relate obesity to some of the major problems in this country. We've already talked a little bit about diabetes and how obesity is an issue in that. So we'll talk more and more as we get into cardiovascular disease, we get into cancer and some of the other diseases. But let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit about obesity. Obesity by definition is basically having more fat than a large amount of fat versus your body mass or lean body mass, and then weight that's greater than what's considered normal. So those are basic kind of rough gauges of obesity, but that's basically what the medical community is going by. But there are some measures that we'll talk about that can determine what your relationship of your body fat is to your lean body mass. So again, looking at the statistics, 64% are overweight or obese, and then 33% are actually obese. So a third of the country is considered obese for adults. What's even more alarming is children. We've got 18%. Basically, an overweight child will be an obese adult. And so that's a concern. That's straight off the bat. 19% of children are prone to be obese. And that's going to go up because the children who aren't obese will become obese is the concern. So we're going to add that on top of that 19%. A big problem, and not only in this country but worldwide. It's getting more and more of an issue as more and more countries adopt kind of an American lifestyle of eating anyway. National costs, a lot of money, as you can tell. And organ costs, millions and millions of dollars looking at the care for overweight and obesity, and its relationship to disease. So anyway, the problem is looking at the trend. The trend, as you can see, has been going up since the 1980s. And that's the concern because it doesn't seem to be going back down. It seems to be going up and up and up and up. And the medical community is really concerned about what we're going to be looking at down the road. We talked about how diabetes is going up and it's a direct relationship to obesity. Again, we can look at some statistics looking at Oregon. We can see prevalence of obesity among adult Oregonians is going up, 2007. But you can also see teens. The obesity rate is going up in young teens, and that is a huge concern. As we talked about, type 2 diabetes is going up in that range. If you look at these, I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but starting in 1985, the key would be to look at the bottom scale. And as you can see back in the 1985, which, if you don't have any data, but this is kind of sketchy data, but I just want you to watch the trend as we go through, that at this point there was very few, none that basically are in the 15 to 19%. Highest was in about 10 to 14%. Then we go to 1987, and you can see as more and more data gets in, we're getting more and more states that are high. And then 1990, we get more and more that are in the 10 to 14 range. But I want to just point out that you don't see any in the 15 to 19% basically, or the 20% range. Now we get into 1994. You can see now we've got some states in the 15 to 19% range. Now, whether that is because more people are going into that range or it's better statistics, it might be just better statistics, but the key is that it's going up. And here's 1997. Now we can see some individuals in the 20% range, and some states in those ranges. And Oregon's not in, a low range, even though we tend to think of ourselves as a healthy, active kind of state. 2000, you can see now we get 20, and here's Oregon, you can see in the 20% range, which again would be alarming. Now look at 2003, we're going above the 20 to 24% and getting into the 25% range. And Oregon's in the 20 to 24% range right now. So you can see it's going up and up. And let's look at 2005, 30 to 34%. We're getting more and more states in that range, and 25 to 29% more and more. Oregon's kind of stabilized there, but let's look at 2006. Again, greater than 30% range. Ooh, look at the 30% range now. Look at 2009. Yeah, look and see it down in this range. Lots of fried chicken, I think, and grits or something going on. Oregon hasn't changed much. Now, whether, again, that's data or it's a reality, I don't know. 2011, again, we're in the 30 to 35% range, and they've added a new category up above 35%. So, you know, I haven't got the 2013 schedule, but I would assume that there's going to be some states in the 35% range. Anyway, the idea is the trend that's going up and up. Kind of interesting that we see bariatric procedures. Now, bariatric procedures would be like stomach stapling and gastrectomies and those kind of things that are trying to limit the amount of food that you can eat by manipulating the digestive system or the stomach and making it smaller or bypassing the stomach, that kind of thing. So you can see, I mean, look at the climb starting in 2005. I've gone to several conferences, and it seems like the medical community, it's nothing to do those anymore. And so sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it's kind of sad that we're at this point where it takes surgery to take care of something that seems like we should be able to do on our own. But anyway, and here's just some examples of what kind of bypass surgery. Gastric bypass is pretty popular, fairly popular. Vertical banding, I don't think they do that too much anymore. The adjustable gastric band is fairly popular, where basically you can adjust it and limit the amount of stomach so you feel fuller sooner. So there's lots of possibilities of how they do these, and I don't know, it's kind of scary to me, but it's being done a lot. There's a lot of those being done, and maybe some of you have done this. I don't know, but anyway, it's pretty drastic, I think. Anyway, back in the 1990s and maybe even early 2000s, you may or may not recall that the big message was eating low-fat food and decreasing the amount of foods that are high in fat. Well, we did a pretty good job at that, actually. The consumers did take that to heart, and they were eating lower fat foods. The problem is they were eating more food because they were substituting that food with carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates, as we'll see later, as you should know, basically if you eat too many of them, they will go to the liver and they will turn to fat. So you can see the amount of pounds of food that as individuals average we're eating. 70s about 1497, and then we got 1900, so about 500 calories more in 2000 per person in 2000. If you 500 calories and 3,500 calories a pound, that would be 500 calories or 500 pounds, I should say, and times that times 3,500, so that's a lot of calories we're eating. Here basically per day we're looking at about 500 calories per day, which is times 7 is 3,500 calories a week, which is a pound a week. Not surprising that we're gaining weight. So we're just eating too much food. And if you look at this chart, we're eating more than of everything. It doesn't matter if it's a vegetable, a grain, or fruit, or anything. We're eating more of everything. So the low-fat message basically has backfired because people started eating more bulk. So these days, what you hear more about is portion sizes and looking at reducing bulk of what we eat, as opposed to low-fat. So basically, you can, we've talked about variety and moderation. You can eat whatever you want. Basically, there is room in your diet for ice cream. There is room in your diet for a hamburger, from McDonald's. But the problem is we got moderation and we got variety. We've got to limit how much of those things we do. Okay. It's kind of an interesting quote here in the 2004 National Geographic, where if you look at the if you look at National Geographic way back then, you'll see there was a huge issue basically dealing with obesity in 2004. But Americans enjoy one of the most luxurious lifestyles on earth. Our food is plentiful, work is automated, leisure is effortless, and it's killing us. Basically, that's the bottom line. Okay. Let's look at the types of obesity. We have two types: subcutaneous, which basically is fat that's above the rectus abdominis or around the hips, so it's outside of the muscle layer. So it's some of you that have had an anatomy physiology, it's in the subcutaneous layer. So we have the epidermis on top, we have the dermis, and then subcutaneous. So it's that fat that's in the subcutaneous layer that builds up and gets more and more and more. So it's more of the Santa Claus jiggly kind of fat. And then visceral is, again, if you've had an A&P, you'll remember the greater omentum and the mesentery around the intestinal tract, and they're full of fat. So they can increase in fat, and they're pressing on they're underneath the rectus abdominis muscles, and so there's a difference where fat can be, and there's a if you're going to be fat, what we're going to say is be subcutaneous, choose subcutaneous. So if somebody gives you an option of, oh, you're going to get fat, so what do you want to do? Get fat subcutaneously or viscerally? Choose subcutaneous. Okay, it may not, it may be jiggly and sloppy, but it's not as prone to affect your health as much. But even though it's going to affect some, not as much as visceral. So let's look at these. So obesity, again, here we're looking at the subcutaneous is around here. Things you can grab with your hand. Visceral is underneath the muscle, the rectus abdominis, and it's right around here in the intestinal tract. So subcutaneous is in the subcutaneous layer. We have two types. We have abdominal and gluteofemoral. So let's take a picture of those. So again, for those that haven't had anatomy, here's the epidermis, here's the dermis, and here's the subcutaneous. This is what's going to fill with fat and be very loose fat. So here's abdominal obesity. So the ones you can kind of grab, and that kind of fat. And then here's gluteofemoral obesity, which is basically, the gluteus and the femoral region is, big. But you don't want, these are things that are kind of touchy to talk about, especially if you're married. You don't want to bring this up because, this guy, only moments putting finished a two-seater climb, never knew it hit him. So it's a sensitive subject that you probably wouldn't want to bring up with a spouse or a significant other because they may take offense to that. But you can, guarantee them that it's not as bad as visceral. I don't know. Visceral obesity is fat in the visceral organs, basically, and we have omental and mesenteric. So for those that haven't had an anatomy, the greater omentum is kind of like an apron that hangs from your stomach and hangs actually over the top of the intestines, and it can become filled with fat. Whereas the mesentery is what kind of keeps the intestines together. So it's kind of like a fan. If you were to pull open the intestines, it would be like a fan kind of thing. But it can fill with fat also. So here's visceral obesity. You can see it's not jiggly. It's kind of hard and it sticks out. And you see a lot of this. And so that's the concern. A lot more with males than females. So females tend to have subcutaneous around the hips, and males tend to have more visceral obesity. And this is the worst kind of fat you can have. So don't choose visceral if you have a choice. But women can get visceral obesity. It just depends. Again, the concern is fat around the abdomen, especially visceral fat, has the highest risk for disease. And we've talked a little bit about type 2 diabetes and the visceral obesity. So you get a little heads up on that. But anyway, it's a concern. The concern also, we talked a little bit about the stressors of obesity and diabetes. And visceral obesity, as we mentioned, is the worst kind because it can increase free fatty acid levels because of its direct relationship to the portal vein, which is going to go right to the liver and cause some real problems and affect what we're going to talk about later, some of the good and bad cholesterol lipoproteins. So anyway, just visceral is the worst. And here's another one that's talking about endogenous free fatty acids from visceral fat. We talked about in diabetes, visceral fat's what's broken down first, and it will release these free fatty acids and result in type 2 diabetes, and we're going to talk about it in cardiovascular disease and also in cancer. But here basically is just the idea, if you have visceral fat, you can see the venous system, that's the hepatic portal vein comes directly from the intestines, goes right to the liver, and can cause some real problems because you release those free fatty acids into the system directly, whereas subcutaneous you don't. It kind of trickles in. So visceral is not a good thing. Not a good thing. Let's look at how you assess obesity. You've probably heard a lot about body mass index. There's some controversy about that because you can, some of the weightlifters or some of the bodybuilders that have a lot of muscle can have a very high BMI because they can have a lot of weight because muscle weighs a lot of weight for height. And so they could be actually categorized in the obese category, which definitely they are not. So there's some controversy about that, but it is the standard. If you would go into a hospital today and ask the standard for obesity, they would look at body mass index. So that's what they've got to go with. So anyway, here's the categories. I would expect you to know these categories. So kind of get them in tune because it's something you're going to hear about down the road. Hopefully they'll add some things to it like we're going to talk about, but the BMI is the gold standard so far, and that's what insurance companies and things in hospitals and physicians and all those are basically gearing their healthcare towards is BMI. Something else that should be added to the BMI is waist circumference, because again, you could be a bodybuilder and be classified as having a high BMI, but your waist circumference may be only 32. It may be really, so that basically means you don't have a lot of visceral obesity. So doing a waist circumference will determine if you have a lot of visceral obesity or not. So this isn't being measured very well. It's kind of right above the hip bones, around in that area there is where you want to measure. So this guy's not measuring very well, but the idea is if you're a man over 40 inches or woman 35 inches in your abdomen, in your waist, then you would be considered to have a lot of visceral obesity, which is not a good thing. One of the better ways, though, is to get your fat percentage done. You can do a lot of weighing up and you don't really know if you're losing fat or not. But if you get a fat percentage done, then when you're losing weight and you keep getting your percentage done and it keeps going down, then you know you are losing fat. Because stepping on a scale just is gravitational push. It doesn't really tell you what gravity is pushing on. It could be you're losing muscle, it could be water weight, it could be fat, you don't know. But if you get a fat percentage, so those are kind of the three things that should be done to accurately diagnose obesity would be the BMI, the waist circumference, and the body fat percentage. There is another scale out there called the body shape index, which kind of does that. It's the BMI plus the waist circumference. So the BMI, as it says, is going to measure bigness, but the body shape or roundness is going to be with a waist circumference. Again, looking at belly fat is that. So I don't think this is not a gold standard, but it should be, I think, because BMI plus waist circumference will give you a lot more information about the condition. And here's another scale. I just thought it was kind of interesting that you're looking at your height versus your waist circumference, and so you can see there is a scale there. So you can use that as you wish. Anyway, we talked a little bit, I think, in diabetes about metabolic syndrome, but I need to introduce it again. I think you need to be really up on this because it is another gold standard in healthcare, especially if you do not have some of the specific risk factors for heart disease. Then, like you don't have high cholesterol kind of a thing or high LDLs, but you have some of these other risk factors, then you would be just as higher risk as somebody who does have high cholesterol. So getting your cholesterol checked is not enough. You need to make sure and look at all these categories. But it's a cluster of symptoms that are basically going to relate to whether you have high risk of heart disease or type 2 diabetes. And some of the causes, if you have insulin resistance, obesity, unhealthy hormonal imbalance, can cause metabolic syndrome. So looking at these, the risk factors are, number one, visceral obesity, what we just been talking about, high triglycerides, low HDLs, small dense LDLs. We'll talk next time about lipoproteins. Well, I think there'll be another lesson after this one considering energy, but then after that, before cardiovascular disease, we'll talk about LDLs or lipoproteins. And there's different sizes, and the different sizes are indicators of whether they're bad, good, bad, or ugly kind of thing. But we have blood pressure, but any of three of these, if you have any three of those risk factors, you would be diagnosed as having metabolic syndrome, which would put you in a higher risk category for type 2 diabetes, for cardiovascular disease, for some other, maybe even cancers and things like that. You need to be aware of these values and make sure. I may expect you to know these on exam, so make sure you're comfortable with what would be considered risk factors for metabolic syndrome. So what's the complexity of obesity? What causes somebody to become obese? Obviously, anything you eat beyond what any input you would have above output is going to convert into fat. That's the only way your body can deal with it. It has to store it. It can't keep it as sugar or something like that. So, anything you eat beyond what you normally need for as far as your activity and your basal metabolism is going to turn to fat. If your calories in and calories out don't match, then you are going to gain weight. Okay. The problem is there's a fine line between being in and out of energy balance. A slide, and I'm going to show you just an example of it doesn't take much to put you out of balance, which is the problem. People don't realize that nibbling and just adding just a little bit over time can add up. So let's just look at this. If you think about a quarter cup of orange juice is 25 calories. So let's say you didn't change your life at all, didn't increase exercise, didn't change your diet or anything, but you just added a quarter cup of orange juice per day. Okay, 25 calories. Over 5 days, so you drink it 5 days a week, that's 125 calories a week. Okay, extra. 52 weeks per year, that's 6,500 calories. Okay, per year. At 3,500 calories, that's almost 2 pounds a year you could gain by just drinking a quarter cup of orange juice a day. So that would be considered out of balance because you're 25 calories over what your output is. So it doesn't really take much to cause a problem. So again, you have to be very careful of nibbling. I know a lot of people, well, I don't eat too much for lunch, but what they do is they nibble during the day. Just a little, oh, that's not very much. I'm going to nibble that. And it adds up, guaranteed, it adds up. Okay. So let's look at the complexity of obesity. Okay, what's the equation? Obviously, again, we did talk about energy imbalance. So eating too not, your intake of food is over and above your physical activity. But it's a complex issue, very complex. Some individuals who have never had a weight problem can't see it. They look at people and say, well, all you got to do is eat less and exercise more. There are some issues with metabolism issues. There's behavior issues. There's all kinds of psychological things going on. There could be some physical things going on. Even though what you're saying is true, eat less, exercise more, it's not that easy, guaranteed. And some of you that have issues with weight understand. Okay, you understand the problems, the emotional aspect of eating and the emotional aspect. I'm sure many of you have been on several diets, and you're going to do it this time. It just does not work for whatever cultural reasons, economic reasons. You get sick and, it just throws you off and that kind of thing. But the greatest areas that can treat obesity would be your behaviors and your environment. Who you run around with, what you eat, what environment do you put yourself into? Do you put yourself into situations where it's easy to overeat? Those kinds of things. So there's lots of well, just as the title says, obesity is a very complex issue. It's more than physical. It is emotional, economic, psychological, a lot of stuff going on. It takes a lot of work. It's one of the hardest things that anyone will ever do. So if you've never had an obesity problem, do not get there. And usually it'll creep up on you. You won't notice it until maybe your 40s. And if you're 18, 20, you say, well, it's a long time. The problem is it just adds up over the years. You need to address it now. It's one of those pay me now, pay me later deals. If you don't deal with it in your 20s, it's going to catch up with you, and you're going to have to deal with it in your 40s and 50s, and it's not going to be easy. And as you can see, if you look around you, it's harder than you think. Okay, because people aren't able to deal with it. It's not working. So don't get there. All right, do whatever it takes. Get an exercise program going. Do whatever it takes in your 20s to make sure you don't get there in your 40s. Okay, so what's the treatment for obesity? First thing that we are taught as healthcare providers, dietitians, is when a person comes in, they have to be ready to lose weight. They have to understand how hard it is going to be. Okay, they have to understand the emotional aspect, that it's going to affect their whole family. If they have a family and they're starting to change their life and the rest of the family doesn't want to, okay, are you willing to pay the price? Basically, it has to be something that's at the top of your list. It's not going to be, I always describe weight loss as a process, not a program. Because a program, like you go to your school, your kid's school program, there's a beginning and there's an end to a program. In weight loss, there is no end. Once you get to the point where you have to lose weight, you will be looking at it and dealing with it the rest of your life. Losing the weight sometimes is the easiest part. It's keeping it off for an extended period of time that is the hard part. So, number one, if you're thinking about doing this or you know somebody who is, are they ready to do what it takes to lose weight? If they are not totally ready, don't even waste your breath. You know, I wouldn't even waste my breath with a person like that. I would say, if you're not ready, then you're wasting both of our times, because it's not going to work. You have to be totally mentally ready for this thing, and sometimes it is hard. So it takes a lot of, your diet, exercise, behavior modification. It works better if you're in a group. Why do a lot of people go to Weight Watchers? They do great. They quit Weight Watchers. They go back up to where they were. It works better in a group. It works better with a healthcare team. It works better when somebody basically is kicking you in the butt and making you realize that you can't go off the wagon. But again, you have to realize it is going to be this way the rest of your life. Some people can deal with that. Some people can't. Obviously, if we have over 2/3 of the country have a problem with this, a lot of people can't. Okay? Have realistic expectations. 1 pound a week. Some people want to lose it all in a week. The problem is, can you lose 10 pounds in a week? Yes, you can. Is it going to be fat loss? No, it's not. Think about it. 3,500 calories a week. Okay? That's 500 calories a day. Okay? So that's a lot of calories, either by exercising or by reducing your food intake. But you see these advertisements, lose 10 pounds a week. Think about it. 3,500 calories per pound times 10. 35,000 calories you'd have to lose in a week to lose 10 pounds of fat. 35,000 calories divided by 7, that's 5,000 calories a day. Normal intake for women, 2,000 calories. For men, 2,500. 5,000 calories a day. That basically means you couldn't eat anything at 150 calories a mile. What are you going to do? 10 miles a day and not eat anything? That's crazy. It ain't going to happen. Okay? So 1 pound a week, 500 calories a day, 250 extra exercise, 250 extra reduction in food intake. That's realistic. Okay? Healthier foods, you can't eat crap. It's not going to work. The goal is you want 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise, but if you add that up, they're suggesting that's to maintain. To lose weight, you actually need 45 minutes a day, 5 to 7 days a week. Okay? To maintain that weight loss is 30 minutes of moderate exercise a day, or 150 for 5 days a week, 150 calories, 150 minutes per week. That's to maintain. To lose weight, you have to go up to 250, 300 minutes per week. Okay, that may seem like a lot. It doesn't have to happen all at once. You can go in 10-minute spurts. All right. So, 300 calories a week is 60 minutes a day. They can go in 10-minute spurts. The goal would be to try to get your heart rate up, but you don't have to do an hour all at once. Actually, it's better if you do it in short spurts. So take a 15-minute walk at lunch during your 10-minute break or whatever. Walk, go up the stairs, park your car a long ways away from where you work. Walk, that kind of thing. When you get home, walk somewhere. Do something. Get on treadmill, whatever you got. Do some exercise. Get that hour a day if you can. Go out. It's okay mowing the lawn, or go out and gardening, or do something. It doesn't work if you try to do it all on the weekends. It just does not work. You need a consistent, at least 5 days a week, an hour a day. Okay. 10-minute, 15-minute spurts where you do a lot, some good moderate intensity, ballroom dancing, walking briskly, those kind of singles, tennis, that kind of a thing. Those are pretty moderate. Even doubles tennis would probably be in that moderate intensity if it's a good game. If you're just standing around because nobody can serve it and it hits the net and you just, I mean, I guess you can run chasing the ball if you hit it over the fence or, you know, hit it into the net or run up to the net. I guess you could do that. But anyway, it takes a lot. So it's not something, you know, to be honest, that I've had a lot of success at, because I've talked to a lot of people about it, but have not been successful. Because again, number one, they didn't realize what they're getting themselves into. They thought it would be easy, but it's not. It's easy for about the first month, and then it gets a little tougher because you get tired of your, you know, eating, not being able to eat what other people eat. You get tired of eating the same stuff, blah, 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 on it goes. And that's true. But you can get a lot of healthier foods, a lot of variety. It takes some work. It's not something you can just throw in the micro and go for it unless you really plan ahead. So anyway, it's difficult. So I'm not sure how it's going to pan out in the years to come. I'm not sure it is, but I'm hoping it will be. So anyway, that ends our session. We don't want our scales to be afraid of us, okay? So do your best, and we'll talk a little bit more about energy input and energy output in our next lesson. See you later.